The town had always been quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that came after too much had been lost. Once upon a time, the streets had been filled with laughter, the sound of children playing and music drifting out of cafes on summer evenings. But those days were gone. Now the streets echoed only with the wind that swept through empty stores and broken windows. At the heart of this fading town stood an old community center. Once painted in bright yellow, its walls had faded into a dull shade of gray. The notice board outside still carried old posters from events that had been canceled years ago. Music nights, art exhibitions, charity dinners. The people had stopped coming one by one until there was hardly anyone left to care. Every evening, when most of the lights in town went out, a single figure could be seen walking toward that old building. He wore the same dark uniform every day, simple, clean, but worn at the edges. His name was Ben, the janitor of the community center. Ben had worked there for years, even when there was almost nothing left to clean. He swept the dusty floors, fixed broken light bulbs, and emptied trash bins that were mostly empty. No one really noticed him. The few people who came by nodded politely but rarely stopped to talk. To them, he was just part of the background, like the creaky doors or the flickering lights. But there was something about Ben that people didn't know. Behind his quiet eyes and slow steps lived a story no one had ever heard. And every night after everyone had gone home, that story came to life in the sound of music. It started softly, like a whisper. In the corner of the hall, half covered by an old sheet, stood a grand piano. It was once the pride of the community center. Years ago, when the town was full of life, it had been played during concerts, weddings, and Christmas gatherings. But after the town's factory closed and people began leaving, the piano went silent too. Dust settled over its surface like a blanket of forgotten dreams. Ben had found it by accident one evening. He was cleaning the hall when his broom bumped against the piano's leg. A dull note sounded and he froze. He pulled the cover back just a little and pressed one key. The sound was faint but still beautiful. That single note reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He looked around the empty hall. No one was there. The lights hummed softly, and outside the wind blew through the cracked windows. Slowly, he sat down on the creaky bench. His hands trembled as they hovered above the keys. Then, almost without thinking, he began to play. The first notes were hesitant, almost shy. But soon his fingers found their rhythm. The music started to fill the room, gentle, flowing, full of quiet emotion. The sound echoed off the walls, wrapping around him like a warm memory. His face softened, his shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. No one knew that before he was a janitor, Ben had once dreamed of being a musician. When he was younger, he had played in a small band that performed at local gatherings. Music had been his escape from everything. But life has a way of changing dreams. When his father fell ill, Ben left music to take care of his family. Then he took whatever work he could find at the factory, in small shops, anywhere that would pay the bills. Years passed, and his dream faded quietly. Like an old song no one remembered how to sing. But that night, sitting at the piano, it all came back to him. The feeling of being alive through sound. He played until his hands ached and his eyes blurred. When he finally stopped, the room was still. He looked around and whispered softly, "It's just you and me now." After that night, he began to play every evening. Sometimes just for a few minutes before locking up, sometimes for hours. He didn't do it for anyone else. The music was his secret companion, the only part of his life that still felt whole. His songs carried memories of his mother humming while she cooked, of the laughter that once filled the community hall, of a town that used to believe in better days. Each note he played was a piece of his heart, a small prayer for something beautiful to return. And though he didn't know it, that prayer was about to be answered. One cold evening, while Ben was lost in his music, a soft creak echoed from the back of the hall. He didn't notice it at first. The piano's melody filled the air, and his eyes were closed as he played a tune that felt like a memory of sunlight. But near the doorway stood someone, a teenage girl named Lily. Lily had been coming to the center to paint in one of the empty rooms. Art was her way of coping with the sadness that had spread through town. Her father had lost his job at the factory, and her mother worked double shifts to keep things together. The center was her quiet escape. That evening, she had forgotten her sketchbook. When she returned to get it, she heard the music. It stopped her in her tracks. She had never heard anything like it before. soft but powerful, full of feeling. The sound seemed to wrap around her, pulling her closer. She followed the notes down the hall until she reached the main room. Through the half-open door she saw him, the janitor. His head was bowed, his eyes closed, his fingers dancing across the keys like he'd been born for it. The light from a single lamp fell across his face, highlighting the lines of age and the calm in his expression. Lily stood there silently, afraid to move, afraid the sound would stop. When he finished the piece, she quickly stepped back into the hallway. Her heart was racing. She had no idea the janitor could play like that. She left quietly, but the sound of his music stayed with her all night. The next day, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She told her art teacher in a whisper, "The janitor plays the piano, really well." The teacher looked surprised but smiled kindly, thinking she must have imagined it. But when Lily insisted, the teacher promised to stay late one evening and see for herself. That evening, Ben was at the piano again. The teacher hid behind the door just as Lily had. When Ben began to play, the teacher's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just that he played beautifully, it was the emotion behind every note. When he finished, the teacher clapped softly, startling him. Ben turned around quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he said, standing up as if he'd done something wrong. The teacher smiled. "Don't be sorry," she said gently. "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." Ben looked down. "It's just something I do to pass the time." "I shouldn't," but she interrupted. "You should. The town needs this, Ben. People need to hear it." He shook his head. "No one wants to hear an old man play piano. They've got bigger problems." She didn't argue. She just smiled and said, "Maybe you'll change your mind someday." But that night, Ben couldn't stop thinking about what she said. Could his music really mean something to someone else? Could it matter? Over the next few days, more people began to find out. The teacher told a friend. The friend told another, and soon whispers spread through the town. People began staying late near the community hall, hoping to hear the mysterious music that filled the night. Ben noticed the change. Sometimes he could feel eyes watching from the doorway. He grew nervous and started locking the doors before he played. He didn't want an audience. The piano was his private world, and he wasn't ready to share it. But life has its own plans. One evening when he was about to leave, he found a small note taped to the piano. The handwriting was messy, probably from a child. It said, "Please play again tomorrow. The music makes me happy." He stood there staring at the note for a long time. Then he smiled. The next night he played again. This time he left the door slightly open. The sound of his music drifted outside into the cool evening air, where a few people stood quietly listening. No one clapped, no one spoke, they just listened. Among them was the mayor of the town. He had heard the rumors and wanted to see for himself. As he listened, something inside him shifted. The music reminded him of how the town used to feel, alive, proud, full of hope. When Ben finished and came out, the mayor approached him. "You have a gift," he said softly. "Would you consider playing for the town festival next month?" Ben froze. "Festival?" he asked. "There's still going to be one?" The mayor nodded. "We almost canceled it. But maybe this is what we need. Maybe your music can bring people together again." Ben shook his head quickly. No, I can't. I'm just a janitor. I'm not a performer." But the mayor smiled kindly. "You're more than that. You just forgot." That night, Ben didn't sleep. He sat by his window staring at the moon, thinking about everything. All his life, he had believed his chance at music was gone. He had accepted his quiet life, content to stay in the background. But now people were listening. People cared. He walked to the piano and sat down. His fingers rested on the keys, but he didn't play right away. Instead, he whispered, "What if they're wrong? What if I fail?" The piano stayed silent, but somehow he felt like it was answering him anyway. So he began to play again, slowly, gently, like the first night he had rediscovered it. And in that moment, something inside him began to change. Every note he played that night carried more than just sound. It carried years of hidden emotion, unspoken dreams, and a quiet message of hope. The janitor didn't know it yet, but that simple act of playing would soon reach farther than he ever imagined. It would echo through hearts, mend broken spirits, and breathe life back into a town that had almost forgotten what it meant to feel alive. He was just one man with a piano, but sometimes that's all it takes. And as the lights flickered in the old community hall, Ben closed his eyes and played on, unaware that behind the door, more people were gathering each night, listening, smiling, and remembering that beauty still lived among them. The music floated out into the cold air, across empty streets and dark windows carrying a promise. Something was changing. The town didn't know it yet, but hope had just started to play again. The next few days passed quietly, but something in the air had changed. The whispers about the janitor who played piano had spread from one end of the town to the other. No one really knew who started it, but by the end of the week almost everyone had heard. The old janitor at the community center? He can play like a professional, one woman said to her friend while standing in line at the bakery. I heard he used to be a musician, said another. Maybe he's famous and we just never knew. Most people didn't believe it at first. To them, Ben was just a man who swept floors and fixed leaky pipes. They'd seen him walking down the street every morning with his lunchbox, nodding politely to everyone, quiet and humble. The idea that he could play beautiful music seemed almost impossible, but the rumor wouldn't die. One chilly evening, a small group of curious townsfolk gathered outside the community center. They didn't make any noise. They just stood there waiting. Through the cracked windows, they hoped to catch a sound, a note, a melody, anything, and then it happened. At first it was faint, like a whisper from inside the old hall. A single note, soft but clear. Then another. Within seconds, the music filled the cold air around them, rich and full of emotion. The crowd stood frozen. Even the wind seemed to stop to listen. No one spoke. They just closed their eyes and let the sound wash over them. It wasn't just music, it was something deeper. It felt like a story being told without words. It spoke of loss, of quiet strength, of hope trying to find its way back into the world. When the song ended, no one clapped. They just stood there, hearts full and eyes wet, not wanting to break the magic of that moment. Inside, Ben sat at the piano, unaware of the small crowd outside. He thought he was alone, like always. The music had taken him somewhere else, into his memories, into the parts of his heart he rarely let himself feel. But as he stood up and turned to lock up for the night, he noticed movement near the door. Through the small glass panel, he saw shapes, people outside. His stomach tightened. He opened the door slowly and a few faces turned toward him. They looked shy, almost embarrassed. Were you playing just now? One woman asked softly. Ben hesitated. Just a bit, he said, his voice quiet. That was beautiful, another man said. It's been a long time since we've heard music like that in this town. Ben didn't know what to say. Compliments weren't something he was used to. He gave a small smile, nodded politely, and said, "Thank you," before locking the door and walking home. As he walked down the street, the sound of his footsteps mixed with the faint echo of the piano still ringing in his ears. He couldn't stop thinking about the look on their faces, the surprise, the warmth, the emotion. He hadn't meant for anyone to hear him, yet somehow it didn't feel bad that they did. The next evening, more people came. Not many, just a few families, some teenagers, and the old baker who used to host music nights at the town hall decades ago. They stood outside again, quietly listening. Inside, Ben hesitated before sitting down. He knew they were there this time. He could feel it. For a moment, he thought about walking away, but then his eyes fell on the piano. The way the wood caught the soft light reminded him why he played. Not for attention, but for peace. He took a deep breath and began to play again. The notes started slow, gentle, like a confession. Then they grew stronger, filling the room and spilling out through the cracks in the windows. He didn't play for the crowd. He played for the feeling, the connection, the healing. Outside, the listeners swayed softly, holding hands, some with tears in their eyes. The music reached something deep inside them that words never could. For a moment, the town that had been silent for years was alive again. After that night, everything began to change. The next morning, the mayor called a meeting at the small cafe on Main Street. The cafe had only a few customers these days, but that morning it was full. Everyone wanted to talk about the same thing, the janitor's music. The mayor sat at the head of the table, stirring his coffee slowly. If people are gathering outside the community center again, he said, that's something. Maybe it's time we use that place for more than storage. A woman who ran the local flower shop nodded. We've all been waiting for something to bring us together again. Maybe this is it. The mayor smiled thoughtfully. Maybe it is. Meanwhile, Ben went about his day like usual. He didn't know about the meeting or the growing buzz around town. To him, life hadn't changed. He swept, mopped, and fixed things. But when he walked past the piano, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of warmth in his chest. That evening, he found a small folded paper on the piano bench. Someone had left it there. He opened it carefully. It read, "Please play again tonight. We need it." He sat there for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Then he placed it in his pocket, took a deep breath, and began to play once more. This time he left the lights on in the hall. If people wanted to listen, they could. Word spread faster than ever. By the end of the week, dozens of people were coming each night. Some brought chairs, others brought blankets, and a few even brought candles. The street outside the community center glowed softly as people gathered under the stars, listening to the music that seemed to come from the heart of the building itself. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms as the melodies flowed. Elderly couples held hands, remembering days long gone. It wasn't just a performance, it felt like healing. Then, one evening, the mayor approached Ben after he finished playing. "Your music is bringing people back," the mayor said, his voice filled with quiet amazement. "You've done more for this town in 1 week than I've managed in 5 years. Ben shook his head, embarrassed. "I just play a bit." "That's all," the mayor smiled. "You don't understand. People are talking again. They're meeting. They're smiling. That hasn't happened here in a long time." He paused for a moment before continuing. "There's something I want to ask you. Would you consider playing at the town's annual festival? We're trying to bring it back this year." Ben blinked in surprise. "Festival? I thought that stopped years ago." "It did," the mayor said. "But maybe it's time it came back." Ben hesitated. "I don't know, sir. I'm not a performer, I just play," the mayor smiled kindly. "That's exactly why you should do it. You don't play for applause. You play from the heart. That's what people need." He left Ben with that thought and walked away. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. He sat by the small window in his modest home, looking out at the moonlit streets. The town was quiet again, but this time it wasn't the same kind of quiet. It felt lighter, as if the air itself was starting to breathe again. He thought about the festival. Could he really do it? Standing in front of everyone, playing? The idea scared him. What if he made mistakes? What if people expected too much? He'd never been trained like professionals. He just played by feeling. But then he remembered the note left on the piano. "We need it." Maybe that was enough. The next morning, when he arrived at the community center, he found something that made him stop in his tracks. The front steps, which had been covered in dirt and leaves for years, were swept clean. Someone had painted a small sign and placed it near the door. It said, "Music lives here." He stood there for a long moment staring at it. Then a small smile spread across his face. That evening, when people gathered again, he didn't hesitate this time. He sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play a tune that was brighter than usual. It started soft but soon turned lively, full of joy and rhythm. Children began clapping along and the crowd laughed. For the first time in years, the community center wasn't just a building, it was alive again. The next few nights were magical. More and more people came. The local baker started bringing warm bread for everyone to share. The cafe owner served tea. Volunteers cleaned the hall and fixed broken lights. It was as if the town itself had remembered how to care again. One night, a young boy approached Ben after the music ended. He held a small harmonica in his hand and said shyly, "I want to play like you someday." Ben smiled and bent down. "You can," he said. "Just close your eyes and play what you feel. That's all that matters." The boy grinned and nodded, clutching his harmonica like treasure. That moment stayed with Ben long after everyone went home. It reminded him of why music mattered, not because of fame or talent, but because it connected people. It made them feel less alone. As the festival approached, the mayor and a few volunteers came to the center to prepare. They cleaned, painted, and decorated. The old piano was polished until it shone under the lights. Someone even placed flowers on top. When Ben saw it, he felt a lump in his throat. That piano had been forgotten for years, and now it looked proud again. He gently touched the keys, whispering, "Looks like we've got work to do." The mayor clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll do great. The whole town is behind you." But even with all the excitement, Ben still felt nervous. He practiced every night after everyone left. playing the same songs again and again, trying to make them perfect. Yet no matter how hard he tried, there was always one wrong note. One stumble one night Lily, the girl who had first discovered him, found him sitting there, frustrated. "You're playing too carefully," she said softly from the doorway. Ben looked up surprised. "Too carefully?" She nodded. "You sound better when you just play what you feel. You don't need to be perfect. We already love the way you play." Her words made him smile. "You think so?" "I know so," she said confidently. "Play like no one's watching. That's what makes it special." After she left, Ben sat in silence for a moment. Then he began to play again. This time not for practice, but for joy. The music flowed easily, honest and pure. It was the sound of a man remembering who he really was. By the time the night ended, the moonlight was shining through the window, and Ben felt ready. He didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. His music was no longer just his. It belonged to the town now, to every person who stood outside in the cold to listen, to every child who smiled, to every heart that had started to hope again. The janitor had unknowingly become the heart of a town that had forgotten how to feel. And as the night faded into dawn, he whispered to himself, maybe it's time to play for them. The festival was coming, and no one in the town knew that what was about to happen next would change their lives forever. The day of the town festival was getting close, and everyone was busy preparing. For the first time in years, the streets felt alive again. The once silent shops had people coming and going, carrying lights, banners, and food trays. Children painted colorful posters to hang along the fences, and laughter could be heard again in the air. It was strange for everyone, this feeling of excitement. The town had gone so long without joy that it almost felt unfamiliar. But nobody wanted to let it slip away. At the center of it all was the old community hall, which had been cleaned, painted, and decorated with strings of small lights. The big windows glowed softly at night, and inside, the piano stood proudly in the middle of the room, shining under a single golden lamp. Ben arrived early every morning to help where he could. He swept the floors, carried boxes, and made sure everything was ready. People often thanked him for his help, but what they didn't know was that his heart was racing every time someone mentioned the festival. He was nervous, more nervous than he had ever been. The thought of playing in front of the entire town made his stomach twist. For years, he had played only for himself. Now all eyes would be on him. Sometimes, while he was cleaning, he would stop and stare at the piano. It looked different now, alive, hopeful, waiting. He'd run his hand gently across the smooth surface and whisper, "Don't fail me now." One afternoon, while he was adjusting the chairs in the hall, Lily came in with her sketchbook. She had been helping with decorations, painting signs that read, "Welcome back festival," and "Music brings us together." Her hands were covered in paint, and she smiled when she saw him. "Are you ready?" she asked. Ben chuckled softly. "Ready? I don't think I'll ever be ready." "You'll be fine," she said. "Everyone believes in you." He looked down, shaking his head. "It's easier when no one's watching. The piano never judges." Lily closed her sketchbook and said gently, "You're not playing to be judged. You're playing because it makes people feel alive again. That's all that matters." Her words stayed with him. That night, he sat at home with the window open, listening to the faint sound of people setting up booths and hanging lights outside. The air smelled of food and new paint. He could hear children laughing in the distance, something he hadn't heard in a long time. He thought back to when the town was still full of music. Back then, he used to watch his friends play at small gatherings, and he'd join in when someone asked. But life had pulled him away from that world. He had chosen duty over dreams, responsibility over art. And now, somehow, life had brought him back full circle. He sat down at the small table, where a few photos from his younger years were tucked under a glass sheet. In one of them, he was holding a guitar beside his father, both of them smiling proudly. His father had always told him, "Son, music can fix what words can't." He whispered those words to himself that night, repeating them like a prayer. The next morning, he woke up early, feeling calm for the first time in days. He went to the hall and opened all the windows to let the morning sun in. The piano gleamed in the light. He began to play softly, the sound carrying out into the quiet streets. People who were setting up nearby paused to listen. They didn't say anything, they just smiled. It was as if the music itself was blessing the start of a new day. When evening came, the festival finally began. The entire town gathered around the square, their faces glowing under the lanterns. Stalls lined the streets selling homemade food, drinks, and small crafts. There were laughter and music everywhere. The smell of fresh bread and roasted corn filled the air. The mayor stood on a small wooden stage and gave a short speech. He thanked everyone for coming and for not giving up on the town. Then he looked at Ben, who was standing quietly near the piano. "And now," the mayor said with a smile, "the man who reminded us of hope, the man whose music brought us together, will play for us tonight." The crowd turned toward Ben, clapping warmly. He felt his heart pounding. His hands trembled slightly as he walked to the piano. The lights above the stage made him blink for a moment. He could see familiar faces in the crowd, people from every corner of town, young and old, smiling at him. He sat down slowly and took a deep breath. The noise of the crowd faded as he placed his hands on the keys. For a few seconds there was silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then he began to play. The first notes were soft and uncertain, like the sound of morning rain. But as he continued, the melody grew stronger, flowing smoothly, filled with warmth. The crowd leaned closer, drawn into the sound. The song he played wasn't written down anywhere. It was something he carried in his heart, a mix of memories, loss, and hope. It spoke without words, telling everyone in that square that even broken things could find their way back to beauty. As the music swelled, people began to cry quietly. Some smiled through their tears. Parents held their children close. Elderly couples swayed gently, remembering dances from long ago. Ben's eyes closed as he played. He wasn't thinking about being perfect anymore. He wasn't thinking about fear. He just played what he felt, letting it pour out of him like a confession. Every note seemed to carry years of silence away. When he reached the final chord, he let it linger in the air before slowly lifting his hands. The sound faded, leaving a soft stillness behind. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't polite applause, it was heartfelt, loud, and full of emotion. People stood cheering, clapping, shouting his name. Children waved their arms. Some even climbed onto their parents' shoulders to see him better. Ben sat there in shock for a moment. Then he smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep inside. He stood, bowed slightly, and whispered a simple "thank you." The mayor stepped forward and shook his hand. "You've done something incredible tonight," he said. "You've given us back what we lost." After that, the music didn't stop. Others came forward to sing, to play small instruments, to dance. The night filled with joy, laughter, and songs that hadn't been heard in years. The town was alive again. Ben stood off to the side, watching everyone. He saw people smiling at each other, strangers talking like old friends, children chasing one another under the string lights. It felt like a miracle. Lily ran up to him, her eyes shining. "You did it," she said. He laughed softly. "No," he said, shaking his head. "We did." The festival lasted late into the night. Some people didn't want to go home. They stayed near the piano, asking Ben to play one more song, then another. And he did, each time smiling a little more. When the night finally ended and the crowd began to fade, Ben sat alone in the hall again. The lanterns had burned low and only the moonlight remained. He looked at the piano and touched it gently. "You did good tonight," he whispered. But it wasn't just the piano. It was the people, the town, the spirit that had come back to life. The next morning, the mayor came to see him with a few townspeople. They were all carrying tools and paint cans. "We're going to fix this place up," the mayor said. "Make it something special again. And we want you to be part of it," Ben blinked. "Part of it?" The mayor smiled. "You've already started something. We're thinking of turning the community center into a music and art school for the kids. You'll teach them." Ben was speechless. He looked around at the hall, the same hall he had cleaned and repaired alone for years. Now it was full of laughter and plans. He could hardly believe it. "I don't know if I can teach," he said quietly. "You already have," said Lily, who was standing nearby. "You taught us to listen again." He smiled, his eyes soft. "All right then," he said. "Let's begin." Over the next few weeks, the change in the town was visible everywhere. The dull gray buildings started to show color again as people painted murals and fixed old signs. Shops reopened. The park was cleaned up and new benches were built. At the community center, children came every afternoon to learn music. Some learned piano, others drums, and a few just sat and listened. Ben was patient with them. He never scolded or corrected too harshly. When a child missed a note, he'd just smile and say, "That's how songs learn to grow." His kindness made everyone comfortable. Parents came to watch, smiling as they saw their children discover new talents. Sometimes he'd still play alone in the evenings, not because he was hiding anymore, but because that was his way of saying thank you to life, to the town, to the people who had believed in him. The mayor invited him to perform again, this time for a charity event. The money raised helped repair the town library and rebuild the playground. Slowly, the place that once felt forgotten became a small symbol of hope for other nearby towns. Ben didn't see himself as a hero. He still walked the same quiet streets, carried his same lunchbox, and helped where he could. But now, when people saw him, they didn't just see a janitor. They saw the man who reminded them that even the simplest person could bring light back into a dark place. He never expected any of this. He never wanted fame or recognition. He just wanted to play music again. But sometimes life rewards those who give without asking for anything in return. One evening, as the sun set and the children left the hall, Ben sat at the piano and played one last soft tune before locking up. The golden light filled the room, and the sound drifted out into the town, carried by the evening breeze. Across the square, people paused to listen. They smiled quietly, knowing who it was. The music had become a part of their lives now, a sound that told them everything was going to be all right. Ben finished the song and closed the piano lid gently. He whispered, "Thank you," as if speaking to an old friend. The town was no longer broken. It was alive, breathing, dreaming again, and at the heart of it all was one man, one piano, and a melody that healed more than just a community. It healed the human spirit. The town had changed more than anyone ever expected. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about how people had started to care again. The streets looked brighter, the air smelled cleaner, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now greeted each other with smiles. There was laughter in the mornings, and children's voices echoed through the park again. Ben noticed all of it, though he never took credit. To him, the music had simply opened a door, one the people had walked through themselves. Every day he woke early and went to the community hall. He'd unlock the doors, sweep the floors, and open the windows to let the sunlight in. Then he'd sit quietly for a while before the children arrived for their lessons. Those early hours were his favorite. He liked the quiet hum of the town coming alive outside, the smell of coffee drifting from the cafe across the street, the sound of a few birds landing on the window ledge. When the children arrived, they filled the hall with noise, laughter, chatter, and the clumsy sound of instruments being tuned. Ben would watch them fondly, never raising his voice, never rushing them. He remembered being like them once, nervous but full of dreams. He spent his mornings teaching them how to listen, not just to the notes, but to the spaces between them. "Music isn't only about playing," he would say softly. "It's about hearing what's inside you first." Some of the children didn't have instruments at home, so he built simple wooden boxes with strings to help them practice rhythm. Others came just to sit near the piano and draw while he played. He welcomed everyone. As weeks turned into months, people from nearby towns started visiting. They'd heard about the janitor who played piano and brought life back to a broken town. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they too needed a bit of hope. One afternoon, a young reporter arrived. She had heard the story spreading through the region and wanted to meet the man behind it. When she approached Ben, he was sweeping the hall after a lesson. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Are you the man everyone's talking about? The one who played at the festival?" Ben smiled awkwardly. "I suppose that's me. Though around here, I'm mostly just the janitor." She laughed lightly. "I think you're a bit more than that now. People are calling you the heart of this town." Ben shook his head. The town already had a heart. It was just quiet for a while. She asked if she could interview him. At first he hesitated. He didn't like attention, but she promised it would help others see what music and kindness could do. So he agreed. They sat at one of the tables by the window, the piano gleaming softly behind them. She asked about his life, his work, and how it all began. He told her about his years cleaning the hall, the loneliness he felt, and how one night he played the piano because he couldn't hold it in anymore. He didn't exaggerate anything. He just spoke honestly, with pauses between his words as if he was still living the moments in his mind. When the interview was published, it touched thousands of readers. The headline read, "The janitor who played hope back into his town." Letters began arriving at the community hall, handwritten notes from strangers thanking him for reminding them that small acts could change the world. Some came from faraway cities. People sent old instruments they no longer used, asking him to give them to the children. Soon the hall was filled with music stands, guitars, violins, drums, and boxes of sheet music. The children were thrilled. It was like Christmas every day. Ben organized small concerts for them, letting them play their first songs in front of their families. The performances weren't perfect. Some notes were missed and some beats were lost, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the joy. Parents clapped proudly, tears shining in their eyes. For many, it was the first time they had seen their children truly believe in something. After one such concert, a father approached Ben. His little boy had played a short melody on the piano, and though it was simple, the man's face glowed with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "My son was so quiet before. Now he talks about music every day. He says it makes him feel brave." Ben smiled and nodded. "That's the magic of it," he said softly. "Music teaches courage in ways words can't." Life moved peacefully for a while after that. Every day followed a calm rhythm. Mornings with cleaning and preparation, afternoons with laughter and lessons, evenings with quiet reflection. But then something unexpected happened. One morning, as Ben was unlocking the hall, he noticed a letter slipped under the door. It was printed on official paper and stamped with a large seal. Curious, he opened it. It was an invitation from a well-known city music foundation. They had read about his story and wanted to feature him at a charity concert in the capital. The event would raise money for music programs in struggling communities. At first, Ben thought it must be a mistake. Why would they want him, a janitor, to play alongside professional musicians? He almost threw the letter away, but Lily, who now helped manage the music classes, stopped him. "You have to go," she said firmly. "This isn't about you being perfect. It's about sharing what you've done." He looked uncertain. "I don't belong on those stages." "You belong wherever your heart is needed," she said gently. He took a deep breath. She was right. The invitation wasn't about fame. It was about giving hope, just like before. A month later, Ben found himself on a bus heading toward the city. He wore his simple gray jacket and carried nothing but a small bag. As the scenery changed from quiet fields to tall buildings, his heart beat faster. He hadn't been to the city in years. Everything looked busy, loud, and fast. When he arrived at the concert hall, the scale of it left him speechless. The place was enormous, filled with gleaming lights and golden railings. Musicians were rehearsing on stage, their instruments shining under spotlights. A tall man with a clipboard approached him. "You must be Mr. Ben," he said kindly. "We're so glad you came. Everyone's looking forward to hearing you." Ben nodded politely, though his hands trembled slightly. He had played for his town, but this was different. There were hundreds of people expected to attend, maybe even thousands. During rehearsals, he sat quietly, waiting for his turn. The professional pianists played with dazzling speed and precision. Their fingers moved like lightning, every note crisp and flawless. When Ben's turn came, he hesitated for a moment, then took his seat at the piano. He began to play the same song he had played at the town festival, the one that carried hope and healing. The notes flowed slowly, softly. At first, the sound seemed small in the giant hall, but then it began to fill the space. The other musicians stopped talking. The conductor lowered his baton. When he finished, there was silence. Then one of the violinists said quietly, "That felt like home." Ben looked up surprised. He realized that even among all the perfection, what people longed for most was something real, something human. The night of the concert arrived. The grand hall was packed. People from all walks of life, artists, families, students, filled the seats. Cameras flashed as the show began. Ben sat backstage, his heart pounding. He didn't have fancy clothes, only his plain shirt and jacket. But that didn't matter anymore. He knew what he was here to do. When his turn came, the lights dimmed. The announcer introduced him simply. "Please welcome a man whose music rebuilt a town." Ben stepped onto the stage to a soft wave of applause. He bowed slightly, then sat at the piano. He looked at the keys for a long moment, then smiled faintly. He began to play. The music rose like a whisper at first, then grew, filling every corner of the hall. It wasn't grand or complicated, it was honest. Each note felt like a heartbeat. It told a story of dust and dreams, of pain and peace. People in the audience closed their eyes. Some cried quietly, others held hands. It didn't feel like a performance, and it felt like a conversation between souls. When he finished, the room was silent for several seconds. Then the applause came, long, thunderous, genuine. People stood, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. He stood and bowed deeply, his eyes moist. It wasn't pride he felt. It was gratitude. After the concert, many people came to speak with him. A music teacher told him she wanted to start free piano lessons in her own town. A young man said he had been about to give up on music, but had changed his mind after hearing Ben play. Ben listened quietly, smiling. Every word touched his heart. When he returned home a few days later, the whole town gathered to welcome him back. They decorated the streets with lights and banners again. The children ran to hug him as he stepped off the bus. He laughed, a sound full of warmth. "I didn't bring a trophy," he joked. "Just stories." "That's enough," Lily said, smiling. "We already have what matters." That night, the community hall filled once more. People wanted to hear everything about the trip. Ben didn't talk much about the applause or the fame. Instead, he spoke about the people he met, the musicians, the teachers, the ones who still believed that music could heal the world. Then, without anyone asking, he sat at the piano and began to play again. The melody was new this time, peaceful, joyful, and full of life. The children sat on the floor, leaning on one another. The adults stood quietly at the back, listening. Outside, the town lights twinkled softly under the night sky. The world might have seen him as the janitor who played piano, but to the people of that town, he was something much more. He was proof that beauty could grow anywhere, even in the hands of someone who swept floors for a living. And though he never sought attention, his story had already begun to spread far beyond that little town. People in other places were talking about starting their own community halls, their own music programs, their own small acts of hope. Ben didn't know it yet, but his melody had started a movement, and as he played that night, with his town gathered around him, he closed his eyes and smiled. He wasn't thinking about fame or fear anymore. He was thinking about how far they had all come, and how one simple song had changed everything. Seasons began to change again. The cold winds of winter brushed gently through the small town, but this time the cold didn't feel empty. The lights from homes and the music from the community hall kept the air warm. Every evening, people still gathered there, children practicing, parents chatting, laughter echoing down the street. Sometimes even strangers from other towns came to visit, drawn by the story of the janitor who brought hope through his piano. Ben never got used to the attention. He still walked to the hall every morning with his old keys jingling in his pocket and a small lunchbox in his hand. He'd stop by the cafe for tea, greet everyone he passed, and quietly begin his work before the children arrived. For him, it was never about recognition. It was about peace, about the way music could make the world feel softer. One morning he arrived early as usual and sat at the piano. He pressed a few keys and smiled at how warm the sound felt against the quiet of the hall. His hands, though older and slower now, still found the right places without thinking. The light from the window fell across the keys, and he thought about how far things had come. There had been a time when this hall was dusty and forgotten. Now it was full of life. Every corner held a story. Every wall had laughter. As he sat there, Lily walked in. She had grown into her role as the manager of the hall, keeping everything organized. Her hair was streaked with a little gray now, but her smile was still the same. "You're here early again," she said. Ben chuckled. "Old habits. The piano doesn't like to be alone." She laughed softly and set down a stack of papers. "We're planning another festival next month. Can you believe it's been 5 years since the first one?" He looked surprised. 5 years already? She nodded. "It feels like yesterday." "This town owes you everything," he shook his head. "No, it owes the music. I just listened when it called." She smiled at him kindly. "You always say that, but you know you're the reason this place is alive." He didn't reply. He simply smiled and began to play a few gentle notes. The sound filled the hall, calm, pure, and warm. Lily stopped what she was doing and just listened. The melody reminded her of that first night years ago, when the whole town had stood together and cried while he played. After a while, he stopped and looked up. "You know, I think this piano is teaching me too," he said. "It's teaching me how to say goodbye to the past." She frowned softly. "Goodbye?" He smiled faintly. "Everything changes, Lily, even music. It has to move forward." She didn't quite understand what he meant, but something about the way he said it made her heart tighten. In the days that followed, Ben continued to teach, but he seemed quieter. Not sad, just peaceful, like someone who knew he had already done what he came to do. One afternoon, while helping a young boy learn a difficult passage, he paused and said, "Don't worry about getting it perfect. Music isn't about perfection. It's about honesty. When you play with honesty, people feel it, even if you make mistakes." The boy smiled and tried again, this time playing with more heart than precision. Ben nodded approvingly. "That's it. That's music." Later that week, a few of his former students, now teenagers, returned to visit. They had gone on to study music in the city and wanted to thank him. They brought flowers, photographs, and stories of how they were now teaching others. One of them said, "We started a small music club at school. We call it the Janitor's Melody." Ben laughed softly, shaking his head. "You didn't have to name it after me." The student replied, "We wanted to remind people that music can come from anywhere, even from a man with a mop and a kind heart." That evening after they left, Ben stayed behind in the hall. The lights were low and the air was still. He sat at the piano again, running his fingers along the smooth edge. He whispered, "You see? They're ready now." He began to play one of his oldest songs, one that no one had ever heard before. It was slow, full of memories. Every note seemed to carry a story. The first time he found the piano, the night of the festival, the laughter of children, the kindness of people who believed in him. As he played, tears filled his eyes. Not of sadness, but of gratitude. The next morning, Lily found him sitting on the bench by the piano, a gentle smile on his face, his hands resting peacefully on the keys. He had passed away quietly in his sleep, surrounded by the thing he loved most, music. The news spread through the town like a soft wind. No one cried loudly. The sadness was deep, quiet, and full of love. People left flowers by the piano. Children brought drawings. Parents stood silently, some with tears, some just holding their hands over their hearts. The mayor announced that the hall would be renamed the Harmony Center, in honor of the man who brought harmony back to their lives. A small plaque was placed above the piano. It read, "To the man who taught us that hope has a sound." A few days later, the town gathered for a small memorial. Lily stood at the front, her voice trembling as she spoke. He wasn't famous. He didn't ask for anything. He just played, and somehow that was enough to heal us all. He reminded us that beauty can come from the simplest things, from kindness, from humility, from a song played when no one is watching. When she finished, a hush filled the room. Then one of the children, the same boy who had learned from him, walked to the piano. He sat down, hands shaking, and began to play the same tune Ben had played at the first festival years ago. The moment the first note rang out, everyone knew. It was as if Ben was still there, his spirit woven into the music, smiling gently from somewhere unseen. The melody filled the hall, and slowly, others joined in. A guitar, a violin, soft humming from the crowd. It wasn't planned, but it felt natural, like the music was guiding them all. The air seemed to shimmer with light. It was more than sound, it was memory, love and gratitude all blending into one. After that day, the hall remained alive. The children kept learning, the teachers kept teaching, and every year they held a special concert in his memory. They called it the Janitor's Night. People from nearby towns would come to listen, bringing candles, flowers, and stories. Each performance ended the same way, with everyone singing softly together, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. Lily kept running the hall for many years. Sometimes when she worked late, she'd swear she could still hear the faint sound of a piano playing in the distance. It was never loud, just a few gentle notes like a whisper of the past reminding her that he was still there. Years passed. The town continued to grow. New faces came, old ones moved away, and life kept flowing. But one thing never changed: the spirit of kindness that music had left behind. Children who once learned under Ben grew up and became teachers themselves. They told their students about him, about how a quiet janitor changed an entire town by following the music in his heart. One spring morning, decades later, a young woman walked into the same hall. She was carrying a small boy by the hand. She stopped by the piano, ran her fingers over the plaque, and smiled. Her son looked up at her. "Who's that man, Mama?" She knelt beside him and said softly, "He was a janitor. But more than that, he was someone who believed that even the smallest person can do something great." The boy stared at the piano, his eyes wide with wonder. "Can I play it?" She smiled. "Of course." He climbed onto the bench, pressed a few keys, and laughed as the sound filled the hall. It was just a few clumsy notes, but they echoed beautifully. The woman felt her eyes fill with tears. Outside, the town looked peaceful, full of color, full of life. Somewhere, the wind carried a faint melody, as if the past and present had become one, and in that moment, it was clear that Ben's music had never really ended. It lived on, in every song played there, in every heart that listened, in every act of kindness that began with a single note. It wasn't just about a piano. It was about what it represented: hope, resilience, and the belief that no matter how quiet or small you think you are, your voice matters. Sometimes all it takes is one song, one person, one simple act of love to remind the world how to feel again. And that was his true legacy. Not the applause, not the fame, but the music that kept playing, long after his hands had stopped. As the last light of evening fell through the windows of the hall, it touched the keys of the piano, making them shine softly. It was almost as if someone invisible had pressed a note, a soft single sound of peace, drifting gently into the night. And somewhere, if you listened closely enough, you could still hear him. Playing, smiling. Alive, in every heart his music ever touched.